All right, good morning. Because we are on a flex day today and we are short on time, I am going to sort of summarize chapter 45, which has to do with the endocrine system. Okay? I'm sure you guys can put me on double time, speed me up so that you don't have to spend as much time. Okay? First thing that we need to remember is that a hormone is going to be a secreted molecule, and that secreted molecule is going to circulate through the bloodstream. Okay? And as it does that, it's going to go to a specific target cells and stimulate some kind of response. Okay? Figure 45.2 in your text is a really good reference. When we talk about endocrine signaling, the purpose is to maintain homeostasis. It will mediate cell response. It will regulate growth and development. And it can also trigger the changes that are needed for sexual maturation as well as reproduction. Okay. So really good examples of paracrine and autocrine regulation are going to be blood pressure regulation, nervous system function, and reproduction. Okay, so all of these are really great examples that you'll be able to use later on. The prostaglandins are important when we talk about the immune system and also blood clotting, which is another great feedback loop to examine. Okay. Nitrogen gas, so NO, is an important signaling molecule. When your O2 in the blood, if those levels decrease, then the blood vessel walls are going to actually release NO. And when they release that NO, that's going to in turn activate an enzyme. And that enzyme is important for smooth muscle cells. And it causes those smooth muscle cells to relax. And when they do that, really that results in vasodilation. And vasodilation is going to allow an increase in the blood flow to your tissues, okay, and thus should increase the amount of O2 that is getting to those cells, okay. There's lots of different endocrine signaling molecules. We can talk about neurotransmitters and neurohormones. We can talk about pheromones. And when we do talk about hormones in general, we sort of split them up into your polypeptide hormones, your steroid hormones, and then your amines. Okay? Obviously, your steroid hormones are going to be your ones that are lipid soluble, and the other two are going to be water soluble. So when we go back and think about cell signaling, the fact that these are lipid soluble is going to be important because they're going to be able to diffuse across the plasma membrane. Okay, so they will diffuse across your plasma membrane, and they will bind to receptors that are in the cell or in the nucleus. So a lot of times, these steroid hormones are actually going to change gene expression directly. Okay. So they work, either they will bond to a cytosolic receptor and form a complex, and that complex then moves into the nucleus, or sometimes they will actually go into the nucleus. But basically, they work as a transcription factor. So examples of those are going to be things like estrogen, vitamin D, and then thyroxine, which is a thyroid hormone. Okay. When we think about the polypeptide hormones, these are usually secreted by exocytosis. Okay. Think insulin, right? So they will be made and then secreted out into the bloodstream. They're going to bind a cell surface receptor. Okay, so something that is on the surface of the plasma membrane. And then they will usually use that signal transduction pathway that we talked about previously. Okay. A great example of this is going to be epinephrine. And hopefully you guys know that epinephrine is also called adrenaline. Okay. And so this signaling pathway actually, I just realized you can see that. This signaling pathway actually uses the G protein coupled receptors. It will trigger the cyclic AMP. And the big thing, its cell response is it takes glycogen and it will break it down into glucose. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because the release of adrenaline or epinephrine stimulates that flight or fight response. And so either way, you're going to need lots of energy. So breaking that glucagon down into glucose is going to help with that process. Okay. One thing is certain hormones do have specific effects, but their effects may be different on different target cells. So sometimes you can have the same hormone causing a different effect on the target cells. And the way that that happens is because they utilize either a different receptor or a different signal pathway. Okay, so there are exocrine glands as well as endocrine glands. Okay, and basically your exocrine glands are going to have ducts. Okay, and so that's really your salivary glands. And then your endocrine glands are going to have no ducts. So these will be things like your thyroid, parathyroid, testes, and ovary. Okay. Now, the next thing that I do want to talk about is what the GoFormative sort of quick check is, and that is the idea of feedback mechanisms. And so what happens with those feedback mechanisms is that they can be positive or negative. So we can look at the digestive system, and as the contents of the stomach enter the duodenum, the stomach contents are acidic. And as they enter that small intestine, we want to make sure that the pH actually goes up. And so the acidic contents will actually stimulate the secretion of secretin. And what that does is that causes the pancreas to secrete bicarbonate. And that bicarbonate, of course, is going to increase the pH. And so in the duodenum, that first part of the small intestine, the pH is then going to raise. Okay. We do have some neuroendocrine that we can talk about where you've got stimulation is going to be received by a sensory neuron, and that will actually stimulate the neurosecretory cells. So neurosecretory cells are going to secrete neurohormones, and they're going to enter the bloodstream and they're going to travel to those target cells. Think about infants. They're always great examples of positive feedback loops. So as the infant actually will stimulate the hypothalamus of the mom. So as the baby nurses, the hypothalamus triggers the release of oxytocin, and out of the pituitary gland, the pituitary then stimulates the mammary glands to secrete milk. The more the baby suckles, the more oxytocin is released and the more milk is produced. So that's a great example of a positive feedback loop. Negative feedback loops, of course, are the opposite. It's when you make something that then turns off the loop. So usually you're going to get an initial response, maybe, as I just talked about, the pH increases in the intestine. So because of that high pH, you get secretin released. That shuts off further secretin release as the pH increases. Okay, so those would be good examples of both negative and positive feedback. There's lots of examples in the text that goes through different kinds of regulation within vertebrates. Okay, so you can pick any one you want. You can pick blood pressure regulation. You could pick blood glucose regulation. You can pick calcium regulation. There's all kinds of different ones available. And so I do want you to summarize one negative and one positive for today's assignment. Okay. When we do talk about vertebrates, we can talk about the role of the hypothalamus, which does coordinate endocrine signaling. Okay, and it receives information from nerves, and then it signals to the pituitary. There's the posterior and the anterior pituitary, and both of them are going to release hormones. Okay. Your posterior pituitary is going to be responsible for antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. We talked about antidiuretic hormone when we talked about osmoregulation. So this hormone does affect whether your kidneys and the nephrons specifically uptake more liquid or whether they excrete more liquid. And then the anterior pituitary is going to be really important when we look at metabolism, osmoregulation again, and reproduction. Okay. So let's see. The thyroid, the thyroid is important because it will release a lot of specific hormones that do help with metabolism. Growth hormone is one that we can talk about, and it will cause the release of the insulin-like growth factor, which is found in the liver. And then from there, that hormone actually affects both your bone and your cartilage, and it will cause both of those to grow. Okay. Parathyroid hormone is important with calcitonin, and those two hormones will use the negative feedback loop to regulate how much calcium you retain or what you secrete out your kidneys. Okay. We talked about epinephrine before, but that's another great example of where a single hormone has many effects depending on which receptor, because we talked about the fact that it breaks down glycogen in the liver into glucose. It does triggers the